Fine, so let's talk about permissiveness again. This time we're talking about Miriam Schoenfeld's paper, Permission to Believe. Now, a couple of interesting things. Miriam Schoenfeld is actually one of the former students of Roger White, the person who wrote the previous paper that we read. So they actually got to talk about this and dialogue about it in real time. So that makes it extra interesting. So Schoenfeld is going to defend a kind of permissivism about what the evidence supports, that supports the possibility that people can disagree about what the evidence supports on the basis of their having different standards for assessing the evidence. So she's going to be the kind of person who says that it's what standard that you have that makes for justifying the kinds of conclusions that you come to on the basis of your evidence. And it's not going to be the case that if you have the same standard as someone else and have the same evidence, that it's going to be permissible to disagree. So a standard plus a total set of evidence does recommend a unique conclusion. It's only in the case where two people assessing the same evidence have different standards that there's room for rational disagreement. So Schoenfeld is going to address mainly one specific broad objection to this kind of view, which is one that White brought up in his paper defending uniqueness. And that's the objection that maybe what standard you acquire could be arbitrary. So if I go to one school and I learn epistemology there, maybe I acquire a particular epistemic standard, whereas if I were to go to a different school, I might acquire a different epistemic standard, and it just seems very contingent, right? I could have ended up somewhere else and I could have learned a different standard, and it's only because I ended up here that I have the standard that I have. So under permissivism, if it's permissible for people to acquire different standards, why then isn't it arbitrary what standard that I currently adopt? So this is a worry that Schoenfeld links to worries that some of her friends have had about their own upbringing and how their own upbringing might have turned them towards particular belief systems in such a way that it seems contingent that they have the belief systems that they do. If we had grown up in a different place than we grew up, we might think different things than we think. And that makes our entire epistemic system feel unstable, because we feel like maybe the reason that we hold on to the beliefs that we have has more to do with contingent features of where we happen to be located in space-time and how we happen to have grown up in a community, as opposed to reasons that legitimately bear on the truth or falsity of the belief. So that's the worry, the destabilizing worry about the arbitrariness of how your standards form. That's a bit of background. Let's dive in now to the details. So let's remind ourselves again of what permissivism is. Permissivism is the view, according to Schoenfeld, that sometimes there is more than one rational response to a given body of evidence. There's more than one rational response. Schoenfeld's main claim in her paper is going to be that it is sometimes rational to maintain our beliefs even upon learning that they were caused by irrelevant influences. She's going to argue for this by saying that if we accept permissivism, the irrelevant influences concern is in many cases unwarranted. So she's going to concede that there will be some cases in which these irrelevant influences should undermine our beliefs, but that according to permissivism, many cases that look like that are going to be fine. We're going to have warranted beliefs. We don't have to give up some of our beliefs just because we learn that our beliefs could be caused by irrelevant stuff. She wants to introduce, first of all, a distinction. She wants to say that there are some cases in which it'll turn out that permissivism doesn't apply for those cases, and cases in which permissivism does apply to those cases. So she wants to kind of draw boundaries to what we're saying is a permissive scenario epistemically. So she's going to say, in non-permissive cases, learning your belief was caused by irrelevant factors may warrant diminishing your confidence in the truth of your belief. Right? So if you're in a case where you're not allowed to have disagreements, and she's going to, then you should diminish confidence in the truth of your belief. And then there's going to be also cases that are permissive. In permissive cases, gaining evidence that your belief was caused by irrelevant factors should not worry you. The rationality of your belief won't be defeated in those cases by the new evidence about the cause of your belief. So maybe you want at least some examples of cases in which it's only possible to answer one way in response to your body of evidence. Like, what makes for a case being a non-permissive case? She doesn't give a definition early on. She just kind of relies on our intuitions about what cases will be and won't be permissive. But it's possible to give examples that most people will agree about, at least for the non-permissive cases. Certainly the uniqueness theorist is going to think that there are non-permissive cases. They're just going to think it's all of the cases, right? So the more problematic thing is figuring out what cases are in fact permissive that we can concede to the permissivist. So a non-permissive case might be mathematical deduction. If you're trying to do a mathematical deduction and you find out that you and a peer came to different conclusions, that's a non-permissive case, right? You shouldn't be able to come to different conclusions when you're doing a deduction. So if you and your friend disagree, one of you, both of you maybe should reduce confidence in your conclusion, but at least one of you is in fact wrong, which is what leads you to think that you should reduce confidence in the thing that you believe. So non-permissive cases will be like that, cases in which everybody agrees, yeah, it seems very likely that everybody should come to the same conclusion. So the bigger problem is whether there are cases that are permissive, cases that allow for different standards to be applied. And she will give us an example of cases like that later on. I just wanted to say this for now. It's going to be kind of a case-by-case determination. Whether we agree with her or not about whether a particular case is permissive, she'll just say, replace it with a case that you think is permissive. Okay, so here's Schoenfeld's main argument. Premise 1, permissivism is true. And that's a big one. We're going to want to argue for it, and she will give us reasons to think premise 1 is true. So premise 1, permissivism is true. Premise 2, if permissivism is true, the view that you should reduce confidence significantly in permissive irrelevant influence cases is unmotivated. Okay, so she's saying if permissivism is true, it will turn out that you won't always have to reduce your confidence a lot if you find out that your belief was caused by irrelevant influences, as long as you're in a permissive case. Okay, and she's going to argue for that view as well. Then premise 3, if the view that you should reduce confidence significantly in permissive irrelevant influence cases is unmotivated, you don't need to reduce confidence in such cases. Conclusion, and this is kind of our first preliminary conclusion, you don't need to reduce confidence on the basis of irrelevant influences in permissive cases. End. So the view is going to be, if we accept that permissivism is true, then it'll be okay. We'll be able to preserve the beliefs that we had, even if they were caused by irrelevant influences, as long as we're in one of the cases that's allowed in. And what the cases are going to be that are allowed in, we have yet to specify, but that's basically what she wants to show, that if your beliefs are caused maybe irrelevantly, but not in the wrong sort of irrelevant way, you're safe. You can keep hold of your beliefs. So most of the action in the paper is going to be defending each of these premises in this argument. And so we should start, first of all, by defending permissivism, because you might think that's the biggest one we need. We need to defend before we even accept that there are such things as permissive cases. So there will be permissive cases only if permissivism is true, right? So what are some motivations for permissivism and for premise 1? Schoenfeld gives us two major ones. The first motivation is just intuitive. So in scientific and other contexts, it seems that people can reasonably arrive at different conclusions on the basis of the same body of evidence. For example, consider there's a scientific disagreement about what it is that actually killed the dinosaurs. Of course, there are bigger camps and smaller camps, and each camp thinks that the evidential support is weighted in their favor, but we think that science is a realm in which people are permitted to have disagreements about what the evidence supports, and then what we need to do is find more evidence to decide definitively. In some contexts, intuitively, it seems possible for intelligent epistemic peers who are good at assessing evidence to disagree about what the evidence supports. Like, the central question here is whether or not the differences of opinion are really a result of differences in standards as opposed to differences in experiences that you had before considering the question, right? So some people have said that it's implausible that any two people have had all of the same evidence because no one has shared exactly the same set of experiences as someone else. And if they haven't had the same set of experiences as someone else, more than likely they don't share the same total evidence. And Schoenfeld wants to say, yeah, sure, there will be cases in which the disagreement can be explained by possessing different evidence. But she says, even if it seems right in some cases to say that, it doesn't seem plausible that all of the cases in which people rationally come to have different opinions are cases that are explained by this difference in access to evidence. So for example, the dinosaur case where paleontologists disagree about what killed the dinosaurs, Rosen talks about it and Schoenfeld talks about it. It seems unlikely, says Schoenfeld, that the disagreement can be rationalized by appealing to subtle differences in the bodies of evidence that the paleontologists have, right? So like, I had different experiences from you because I climbed this mountain and you climbed that mountain. But that doesn't seem to be the thing that decides the difference between our conclusions. So although paleontologists grew up in different places, the evidence that's relevant to determining why the dinosaurs died isn't something about that. It's about stuff that paleontologists study as academics, and presumably they publish this information in a way that makes it accessible to other paleontologists who maybe haven't been to the same excavations that they've been to, who haven't looked at the geological data like first personally, and it's part of the scientific process. They should make the relevant evidence accessible to somebody. So the relevance part is important here. If we only consider the relevant total evidence, just Schoenfeld thinks that there must be cases in which sometimes the diversity of opinion can't be accounted for by a diversity of evidence. At least if we're doing responsible science and we're making all of the evidence accessible. So she thinks that it's still going to come down to standards and not that all cases will be explained away by people having different experiences. So anyway, Schoenfeld just thinks that's one really big good reason to trust in permissivism. It's just that intuitively we can use it to explain cases like the paleontologists disagreeing about what killed the dinosaurs. Maybe you can think of another scientific dispute that you think it makes sense to say that the experts share all of the relevant evidence. So here's a second argument that she gives in favor of permissivism. This argument isn't dependent so much on intuitive motivations as on theoretical motivations. So she points out that a variety of different epistemic theories, including coherentism, conservatism, and subjective Bayesianism, all require permissivism to be true. Schoenfeld says if you were already inclined toward one of these three views, which some people are, you would have reasons to favor permissivism. But she also says an additional thing, which is that rational capacities can enable us to make a broad range of general computations and inferences and judgments and things like that. But that variety of things that we can do aren't so fine-grained for Schoenfeld that they determine a unique attitude, such as like a unique credence or a unique belief in every case in which they're applied. So on Schoenfeld's view, our rational capacities aren't targeted enough to make it possible for us to always agree on the basis of the same evidence. So if you agree with her about that, and in particular, maybe you think that it is the case that interpretation, for example, of evidence is an important additional factor besides the evidence you possess in what the evidence is meant to support, and you think that people have different interpretation capacities or room for interpretive differences that is permissible, then you'll be inclined toward permissivism as well. In short, she's given us two reasons to favor permissivism. One is some kind of intuitive considerations, thinking about cases that have actually happened and that are currently occurring, where we think people are being rational even as they disagree. and also thinking about theoretical motivations that we might have besides being permissivists already that might make us be sympathetic toward permissivism, or maybe even make it necessary for us to adopt permissivism. So now let's get to the specific kind of permissivism that Schoenfeld in particular is going to defend. She says, this is her permissivist view, what one ought to believe depends in part on what epistemic standards one has. So her permissivism is a kind of standards permissivism. And what are epistemic standards? Schoenfeld is understanding epistemic standards to be a function from bodies of evidence to doxastic states, which the agent takes to be truth conducive. So epistemic standards are things that take evidence and kind of output truth conducive doxastic states. Those functions might look different for different people. For some people, if you have evidence A, B, and C, and like evidence A is like perceptual evidence or something, and B and C are testimonial evidence or something, then maybe their standard, and this is just me pulling things out of thin air, maybe their epistemic standard says weight A more heavily than B and C, and on that basis output some kind of belief that I need to have about what the evidence supports. I'm going to favor the perceptual evidence over the testimonial evidence, although I won't discount the testimonial evidence. And so my function will look that way, but maybe there's someone else who thinks that, you know, the testimony of B and C is very important to take into consideration, maybe because the testimony is coming from like a particular expert. And so maybe I'd be inclined to actually weight their testimonial evidence above my own perceptual evidence because I have reason to distrust my own expertise or something. And so I'll actually weight B and C more heavily. And so my function will produce a different doxastic state, although in both cases, each of us will think our doxastic state is truth conducive. So I will think that my own belief is the thing most likely to get me to the truth. And that's why I apply the standard that I apply, right? So according to Schoenfeld, she's a permissivist because there are multiple permissible epistemic standards. Now that we've talked about some reasons in favor of permissivism and we've specified the kind of permissivist view that Schoenfeld has, let's talk about some worries for permissivism. One of the worries is the evidence-pointing problem, Schoenfeld calls it. So the evidence-pointing problem says that the evidence only points in one direction. This is the thing that White mentions about how evidence is supposed to be something that favors a proposition and disfavors its negation, right? And if it doesn't do that, then it's not really evidence in favor of any proposition. So if every piece of evidence is supposed to favor one proposition and disfavor another proposition, how could it be the case that a set of evidence is permissibly multiple in terms of what it can support? So if you think that the first thing that I said is true, that evidence only points in one direction, it seems like the second thing about the collection of evidence doesn't favor permissivism. Schoenfeld's response to this objection is to say that the different epistemic standards view doesn't actually think that there's only one dial pointing in different directions. It thinks that there's multiple dials. So on their view, no single standard will ever warrant belief in both P and not P, both P and its negation. But if you've got multiple standards, depending on what standard you apply, is what proposition the evidence supports. Evidence by itself, you can kind of take Schoenfeld to say, doesn't point in any single direction. You kind of always need to apply an epistemic standard to the evidence. And if you and I share that epistemic standard, in a sense, we're sharing the dial. All of the things that we receive will point in the same direction. But if you have one dial and I have a different dial and we each get the same input, we won't necessarily produce the same output. So Schoenfeld is kind of negating that evidence already comes with a particular kind of supporting relation. It's only going to support something in light of a particular standard. Now, the second objection to permissivism that Schoenfeld talks about here is the worry about arbitrariness, which we were discussing earlier. The worry about arbitrariness asks, why is it not the case, if you're allowed to come to a different conclusion than me about the same evidence, that it's just arbitrary what we believe? Like, why shouldn't it just be the case that I take a pill or get knocked on the head rather than go through all of the work of trying to think through what the evidence supports, if it just turns out that I'm permissive with respect to what I can conclude? If I can conclude the opposite of what I conclude and it's just as good from my meta-epistemic position, why even bother, right? So that's the arbitrariness worry. Schoenfeld's response is to say, let's think about it for a second. Let's look at the details, basically. Suppose that you take a pill and the pill directly changes the belief that you have. If it doesn't correspond to my acceptive truth-conducive standards, then I will prefer to form my beliefs the regular way in the first place. So if by taking the pill I end up coming to a conclusion that doesn't fit my standards, I wouldn't take the pill. That wouldn't seem legitimate from my point of view. So that shows that that can't be the way that the pill is going to be a problem for arbitrariness. Now, suppose instead that the pill that I take changes what standards I have. Taking the pill makes it be the case that I have a different belief because it changes my standards. Now, from my current perspective, given that I think my present standards are truth conducive, right? I have faith, I have trust in my standards, presumably for some further reasons that I think that they lead me to what's true. I won't like that way of forming the belief either. I won't like the idea of adopting an arbitrarily different standard that I'm not sure from my own perspective is truth conducive. I have no reason, independent of my standards of reasoning, to think that my standards are more likely to lead to the truth than some alternative for me or the uniqueness theorist, according to Schoenfeld. So she's saying that I can only ever evaluate things from within my own standard, and from within my own standard, the pill looks illegitimate. And it's going to look illegitimate for me and for the uniqueness theorist. So if the pill changes my standards, I'm not going to like it. And if the pill changes what belief I come to, I'm not going to like it either because it's not going to agree with my standards. So she just thinks that her position isn't as arbitrary as the opponent makes it out to be, because it's not arbitrary why I have the standard that I do. But she also has a second response to the arbitrariness worry, which is to say that for her, the principles of rationality are general. Quote, they're not sufficiently robust to pin down a unique doxastic state given any body of evidence. So Schoenfeld is basically saying, like, if we continued doing epistemology and kept finding some principles of rationality, we would never find a set of principles of rationality that would be so specific that they would give exactly one doxastic state in response to any body of evidence. So suppose that I'm a judge going over a court case and trying to decide whether the decision by the previous circuit court or something was okay. So I have the laws in front of me, I have the decision by the judge, I have like the plaintiff's case, I have the defendant's case, I have all of the information, I'm sitting there, I'm thinking about it. The standards say that, for example, I should take my time considering the evidence in front of me, I should read the text carefully, I should, listen to legal scholars and experts, I should be aware of what the different opinions are about how to interpret the rule of law, and hopefully I should also have legitimate credentials in my profession. Beyond that, though, there may not be any further specific standards that make it be the case that a specific conclusion is ruled out a priori, right? Those standards, while really, really good rational standards for being a good, Juris Doctor, a good judge, won't determine how I should decide the case, according to someone like Schoenfeld. She just doesn't think that even if we kept investigating rationality forever, that we would come up with such a specific set of rules that it would tell the judge what to rule in every case. She just doesn't think that that's part of the content of epistemology, basically. And maybe that has to do with the sorts of operations that we have to do on the information that we have. We can't all use deductions for everything all the time. Deductions lead you to unique conclusions, but inductive inferences don't always, right? Inference to the best explanation, presumably there's some room for disagreement about what the best explanation is about something. And then there's abduction, which is a kind of reasoning by analogy, and there's interpretation of text, and then there's referring to different experts and weighing what different experts say, and it just gets really thorny, and it's not clear that rationality is going to be that exact about how exactly to come to conclusions. So that's her second response to arbitrariness. She just thinks it's not against the rules of rationality to say that we can adopt different standards of how to evaluate evidence. There might be certain standards that are illegitimate from the point of view of rationality, but it can't be the case that there's only one rational standard. At this point, we turn to premise 2 of her argument. Recall premise 2 says, if permissivism is true, and suppose we've taken ourselves to have established the truth of permissivism, then the view that you should reduce confidence significantly in permissive irrelevant influence cases is unmotivated. So premise 2 says that you shouldn't have to reduce your confidence anytime that you find out that your belief was caused by irrelevant influences, as long as permissivism is true. So how does she defend that? How does she defend that it's consistent with permissivism that you're allowed to keep your belief even if you find out that it was caused by an irrelevant influence? One thing that she asks in order to defend this premise is, what is it that's worrying us about there being irrelevant influences bearing on our beliefs? She has a couple of hypotheses about maybe what it is that is worrying us. So suppose that you're in a case where you've worked through a logic problem and you've concluded that proposition P is true. You then learn that your evil logic teacher flipped a coin. If the coin landed heads, she did nothing wrong, but if it landed tails, she flipped a reason-destroying drug in your coffee. People who reason through logic problems under the influence of this drug nearly always get the answer wrong. You wonder whether you ought to reduce confidence in P. So she thinks that that's a case in which it's clear that you should reduce confidence in P. And why is it the case? The first hypothesis is that the reason you should reduce your confidence is that your belief might not be rational. You should reduce confidence because you realize upon learning about the drug that there's a significant chance that the belief you ended up with is irrational. Schoenfeld thinks that this case isn't one in which we need to worry about permissive irrelevant causes cases. Why? Well, because this is one case where it's not permissive. The results of the math problem aren't a case where we think we're facing a permissive case in the first place. Now consider a second hypothesis for why your belief could be irrational. So this is the truth independence hypothesis. Suppose that independently of your reasoning about whether P, you reasonably think, were I to reason to the conclusion that P, in my present circumstances, there's a significant chance that my belief would not be true. Then, if you find yourself believing that P on the basis of your reasoning, you should significantly reduce confidence in that belief. So Schoenfeld is going to argue in a minute that actually truth independence is not correct, and we shouldn't adopt that view. She's going to say that rational independence is the better principle, and that rational independence is not at odds with permissivism. But because truth independence is at odds with permissivism, then it's not going to be an issue for her view. So basically she's going to say she can account for what's wrong in irrelevant influences cases that we should adjust our beliefs in by appeal to one of these two principles. And she's going to say that the other one, which recommends reducing confidence even in cases that she thinks are permissible, is not going to make sense. So that sounds a little complicated. So it might be worth getting into the example that she thinks is crucial for her case and talking through the right way to assess this example. So I'm just going to give you her argument in premise conclusion form. And this is an argument defending premise 2 of her original argument. The idea that you shouldn't always have to reduce confidence in irrelevant influence cases that are permissive, right? So here's the argument. Premise 1, the best motivation for reducing confidence in permissive independence influence cases requires truth independence. So it requires the principle truth independence. Premise 2, truth independence says to decrease confidence in all permissive cases, not just the ones that have irrelevant factors. Premise 3, if you have to give up your belief in all permissive cases, there are no permissive cases, right? If you have to give up your belief in all of the permissive cases, then there aren't any, and then that's a problem for permissivism. So premise 4, truth independence is inconsistent with permissivism. So if you've already accepted permissivism, you can't accept truth independence, is sort of what we're saying. And truth independence is the thing that would be really problematic for the conclusion that Schoenfeld wants to come to. So if it turns out that it's not consistent with permissivism, then she can have an internally consistent view and still have a standard by which we can explain why we're worried about irrelevant factors influencing our beliefs, and which cases are the ones in which we should reduce confidence because of irrelevant factors, if that makes sense. So let's talk through an example that is kind of the clincher, the core example. So this example is called community, and community says the following: you have grown up in a religious community and believe in the existence of God. You have been given all sorts of arguments and reasons for this belief, which you have thought about at great length. You then learn that you only have the religious beliefs that you do, and only find the reasoning that you engaged in convincing because of the influence of this community. If you had grown up elsewhere, you would have, on the basis of the same body of evidence, rejected those arguments and become an atheist. So this is the example that we're going to call community. Now, the threat of community is that it seems like the beliefs of the subject in community are irrelevant factors to the truth of the belief, the conclusion that they have. Say, a belief about theism. Whether or not theism is true seems irrelevant. Sorry, whether or not theism is true, it doesn't matter whether or not you grew up in a particular community. What community you grew up in is irrelevant to the truth of theism, right? Presumably, if something is true about a supreme being, it's true, period. It doesn't matter what part of society you were raised in. So that should be worrisome, because that sounds like it's an irrelevant factor. And Schoenfeld wants to say that because this is a permissive case, and she'll say more about this in a minute, because this is a permissive case, it's not one in which you should reduce confidence in your conclusion. So even though there are irrelevant factors, it's not like the drug case. It's not like that case, because the drug case is one that's not permissive. You're not allowed to come to any other conclusion in that case. And so if you find out that your conclusion was arrived at through irrelevant factors, you should reduce confidence. But in this case, in community, even if you have irrelevant factors influencing you, because it's a permissive case, then it might be okay. So what Schoenfeld is going to want to say in short is that the thing that's okay about this case, even though the belief was formed because of irrelevant factors to the truth of the belief, this case is not one in which your rational faculties are impacted, is what she wants to say. So the belief, while formed in part due to irrelevant factors, it's not irrational. That's not the thing that is being impacted by these irrelevant factors. It's not your rationality that's being impacted. Now, if it was your rationality that would be impacted, then Schoenfeld would be thinking that that is a case in which you should reduce confidence in the truth of your belief. But suppose that, under different circumstances, you were to reason differently, but it's not because the difference in the circumstances is a difference in your rationality, then it's fine. So as long as you were rational in the community, the agent, you, or whoever, should be fine coming to the conclusion that they came to. The irrelevant factors weren't affecting your rationality, so that's cool. The alternative explanation for irrelevant factors that we were considering is the explanation that it's the falsity of the belief that's the problem. The problem is that the irrelevant factors influenced you coming to a belief that might not have been true. And if that were true, then you should reduce confidence in your belief, because the factors that cause your belief aren't pertinent to the truth of the resultant belief, right? It doesn't matter whether you grew up in, say, a Hasidic Jewish community or a conservative Catholic community, like whether or not it's true that the Catholic God exists is independent of where you grew up, right? And so the community experiences that you have are irrelevant to the truth of whether such a supreme being exists. And if you think that the community you grew up in is going to lead you to beliefs that were irrelevantly caused, that have nothing to do with the truth of the scenario, under the hypothesis of truth independence, you should reduce confidence in your belief in, say, the Catholic supreme being. And Schoenfeld wants to say that truth independence isn't what we should use to explain the problem with irrelevant factors. The problem with irrelevant factors is only if they affect your rationality. So why should we give up the hypothesis of truth independence? Schoenfeld says that it's because it tells us to give up our belief in permissive cases all of the time, even when everything is hunky-dory, as she says. So think of the following example. Consider an agent and call him Caveman. Caveman is a perfectly rational being who sits in a cave and carefully considers the arguments for and against the existence of God. No drugs, no zaps, no communities, just pure, unadulterated reason, says Schoenfeld. Suppose that after careful deliberation, he comes to believe that God exists. Let's call this proposition G, on the basis of the same reasons that you are given in the community case. He also recognizes that someone could rationally reject G on the basis of the same evidence that he has. If permissivism is true, cases like this must exist. But Schoenfeld is going to show, even if this is an idyllic case where permissivism looks like it would be true, truth independence will tell the agent to give up his belief in G. So here's Schoenfeld quote on page 207 of her Noose article. For Caveman to determine whether he could maintain his belief in God given truth independence, he must think about how likely he is to be right, in a way that is independent of his reasoning about the existence of God. As in the other cases, we can think of the perspective from which Caveman has to reason as the one that Caveman was in before he went into the cave to deliberate about the existence of God. From this point of view, how likely should he think that it is that, were he to reason to the conclusion that God exists, this belief would be true? Answer, not very likely. The reason is as follows. Once Caveman has set aside his reasoning about the existence of God, what he is left with is a perspective that is neutral with respect to the existence of God. From this neutral state, he should think it's unlikely that he will form a true belief about God's existence on the basis of his reasoning. This is because he knows that his case is a permissive case, and so both G and not G are rational given his evidence. If he cannot appeal to the actual reasoning and standards that led him to the conclusion that he reached, he has no reason to expect that, of the two rational positions he might adopt, he will come to have the correct one. Thus, even in this idyllic permissive case, truth independence would tell Caveman to give up his belief in G. And so, if we accept truth independence, we get the results that even when there are no irrelevant influences, the Caveman case has no irrelevant influences to his belief, we should give up belief in permissive cases. This means that there could be no idyllic permissive cases like the one I described. Since permissivism says that there could be such cases, truth independence is inconsistent with permissivism, unquote. So the problem with the truth independence condition, according to Schoenfeld, in a deeper manner, is that truth independence says that we should set aside whatever standard we use for determining whether or not evidence supports a particular conclusion. We should abandon all of our standards and look only at whether or not the belief that results is likely to be true. And if you do that, then you're basically saying, independently of your standards, try to tell me whether or not the belief looks okay. And you can't do that independently of your standards, thanks Schoenfeld. So you've got to come up with a different rationale for why some cases are cases in which you should reduce confidence in your belief if you know that your belief was produced by irrelevant factors. And the best explanation for that isn't going to be truth independence, which is going to like not play well with your standards, because it's going to say, don't bother with your standards. It's going to be a different case, like rational independence hypothesis. So rational independence only requires that your belief be formed rationally, which the caveman's belief was. And so then we can keep the idea that his case is one in which he's permitted to have a different belief than someone else who came to a different conclusion about whether God exists. And similarly, it's going to be the case that community is likely to be a case in which, even though there are relevant influences, the agent in community doesn't have to reduce their confidence in their belief just because they formed it because of irrelevant factors. The only thing that matters is whether or not they have consistent rational standards along the way, right? So because they do, if they do, then community is a permissible case where they're fine staying equally confident about the truth of their conclusion. So the paper goes on after this, and it talks about the principle of reflection, whether knowing what you're going to conclude in the future should influence what you should think is true now. And it talks also about other cases that may or may not be permissive cases. Things like, if you went to a different school for graduate school or something and knew that if you went to that school, you were going to believe a thing different from what you had reason to believe before, is that a reason for you to change your beliefs? And Schoenfeld basically applies her theory to those cases. I won't discuss that now, but it is quite interesting. And one maybe summary of her view is that basically what matters to Schoenfeld is whether or not your future self has the same standards of reasoning as you have now. If your future self has the same standards of reasoning as you have now, that might give you reason to adjust your belief now or your credence now. But if you're not sure whether your future self has the same standard, or if you do know that your future self has a different standard, from your perspective now, there shouldn't be any reason to change your credence or your belief in that proposition. So that's the thing that she thinks will be consistent with permissivism. So it'll depend on a couple of things, whether or not it should worry you that going to a different school might change what your set of beliefs will be about a set of theoretical or experimental problems or something like that. So if you're interested in that, please go ahead and read that second section of her paper. This is where I'll stop for now. In summary, Schoenfeld defends permissivism on the basis that she thinks it's intuitive and it's theoretically motivated by certain views in epistemology, and furthermore that it can help account for some of our intuitions about what is wrong with irrelevant factors influencing our beliefs, without that making it be the case that we have to abandon the idea that people are allowed sometimes to have their beliefs caused by things that are just facts of life, about where we grow up and who we associate with. Those people can still be rational, even if it turns out that the way in which they believe things could have been different had they grown up somewhere else. And what's going to explain that is that as long as they have consistent rational standards, the belief in question won't be a problem. It does mean, of course, that for the permissivist, some people will come to different conclusions, and that's rationally acceptable, but permissivism doesn't require then that everybody is right. It only says that everybody in these permissive cases is rational. That doesn't then necessitate that everybody who has a different belief has a true belief. So it is still going to be the case that it can't be true that P and true that not P, but it will be the case that you could have a rational belief that P and I could have a rational belief that not P, as long as it was our standards that made for the difference in evaluation of the same evidence. So that's it. Let's see what you think about this view, and thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you all very soon. Bye.